All right, so welcome to our final week of Module 2 for the M in MEL. Can you believe that we're already 6 weeks down of this course? It's pretty exciting. So as always, we're just going to be recording the session today for those who cannot make it, and we'll only be recording the plenary. So as this is the final week for the M in MEL, we're actually just going to go through any outstanding questions that you might have on both developing a theory of change as well as building a measurement framework. So I will ask Leanne some questions. So some of the outstanding questions from the conversations last week, as well as things that have been popping up in the discussion forums on Yammer. But feel free anytime during the conversation to type anything else in the chat, or if you want to request to unmute yourself and ask a question, feel free to do that as well. So any opportunity based on anything when you came across through the assignments for developing a theory of change, as well as any of the content that you're still a little bit unclear about. So Leanne, I might ask you a couple of questions just while we might be waiting for the questions to come through in the chat, just to spark up the conversation. So I guess the first ones first is, how do we know what type of measurement strategy to use from what is in our theory of change? How do we marry the two?
Thank you, Keisha, and hello again, everybody. Really good to see your faces again. Yeah, this is a great question. This was a question that was posed last week and we didn't get to answer it, so we thought it's a great question to start off with this week. How do we know what type of measurement strategy to use from what's in our theory of change? So it's a really good question, and I guess going back to some of the principles we use. So I think this is what's difficult for people. There's no right or wrong, right? Which means you have to really think about it. And how do you think about it? So some of the principles we talked about for measurement last week are really relevant here, and that is don't just measure at the output level or the activity level, and don't just measure at the high level. Make sure you've got some measures in the middle in your intermediate outcomes area, because these are a sure way of understanding that you are on track to achieving your longer term or high level outcomes. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing is that the measures you choose really need to be suitable in terms of they don't cost too much. You can do it with the resources that you have available. And by resources, I don't just mean the people you've got available in terms of human capacity, but also their skill set. So what are people comfortable doing? Then another important thing is to think about who the audience is. So when we decide on measures, we want measures that help us as project managers understand our project's on track, it's achieving what it's supposed to achieve. We also have to be mindful of what the funder might want to understand and what other stakeholders, for example, a delivery partner, might want to know. And so your measures must be chosen in that context. You can't just look at the outcome and say, what might be a good measure? You need to you need to think about those audiences, have those in mind, and then say, okay, given who the audiences are, what would be a useful set of measures? And what would be a balanced set of measures across the model? And what are the kinds of things that we can measure with the resources we have available that aren't going to be too much of a burden to us, but are actually going to give us data at the same time that will be useful for understanding and demonstrating our impact, and from which we can bring data. We can bring data to it. So that's there's no right or wrong. But it's a bit of intuition. It's a lot of intuition and thinking. You can see Maribel's just asked a question, I think, related to in the chat, related to what we're talking to. How can we differentiate measures to indicators and targets? Yeah, great question. So people often use measures and indicators in the same way. They're not that different. And because people use these terms interchangeably, I wouldn't worry too much about what's an indicator, what's a measure. But a really important thing is the difference between a measure and a target, or an indicator and a target. So let's say a classic indicator that everyone's aware of, an indicator of health is that we can check our temperature and we know that we're healthy. In our temperature, our body temperature is one indication of our health. Yeah. Target, because we know what a safe or good temperature is for human health, 36.9 degrees, you can think of that as a target. So an indicator might be temperature, the target might be what the temperature needs to be. So target brings some quantification to your indicator, but it's not the indicator. So some indicators have no targets and other indicators do. So always think carefully about whether you need an indicator, a target or not. Not all indicators need a target. So sometimes you might just say, oh, I expect to see an increase in something. So maybe in student capacity to do something. We're teaching students to do something. We expect to see an increase in capacity. You may or may not set a target. If you set a target, you might say, I expect to see a 60% increase. Okay, so that's the difference between an indicator and a target. I have to open up the chat box, Keisha, to look. So do you mind reading the questions out for me?
Yeah, sure. So we have one from Ali saying, how do we draw a line between stretch and hurdle targets?
Yeah.
How do we distinguish them?
Yeah, okay, yeah. So some people choose to have hurdle targets. I think the concept of hurdle and stretch targets mostly comes from what funders ask for. So funders usually set hurdle targets. Okay, they usually say, if you achieve this, we'll keep funding you, or your funding is contingent on you achieving this much. And so that's usually a hurdle target. It's usually set at the output level because outputs are easier to measure, and most contracts are based on outputs. Still, stretch targets tend to be more at the outcome level. They're more aspirational. They're the kind of things you'd love to see, but they're bigger than what you need to see. So you can think of a hurdle target as what we need to see, the bare minimum. Okay, we'll keep getting funded. Our project will be approved if we reach this target. But what we'd really love to see is this. And so only you can decide what a stretch target might look like, because it has to be very much embedded in the context in which you're working. So a stretch target for someone might be a hurdle target for someone else because of the context they're working in. But you can imagine you're going into somewhere where you haven't tried to do something before, and you would maybe set the target low, relatively low compared to, say, another project, because it's something new and you're seeing if it's going to work. So you're not putting too much pressure on expectations there. I want to pause when I've answered a question for a moment so that people can ask any follow-up questions, or if they want me to clarify something I've said or repeat something I've said, I'll give you that opportunity. So we've talked about the answers to 3 questions already. How to know what type of measurement strategy to have against your theory of change. What's the difference between a measure and an indicator and a target? And we've also talked about how to distinguish between hurdle targets and stretch targets. So I'll just pause for a moment and see if there's any clarification you would like on those 3 questions, whether I've answered them to your satisfaction. And I'll have a sip of water while you're doing that. You answered right for me. Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Maribel. Let's continue, Keisha.
Sure thing. So from Fuatino, the question was, how do you determine what type of measures you should use? So for example, when do you normally need to use rubrics, for instance?
Yeah. What type of measures you use? Yes, I think you're referring to those measures we talked about the other day. You could just have a number, you could have an open vessel, you can have proportions, you could use a rubric. So yeah, it does depend on the context. some things lend themselves very, very well to a simple count. They're important to know. And it's pretty obvious when a count will do. And I think your question is, around more complex measures. I think the main thing would be to keep the measure as simple as possible, but not simplistic, right? So it doesn't need to be any more complex than it needs to be, but it needs to be sufficiently sophisticated for your context. These open vessel indicators that we talked about last week are around where you don't exactly know how change is going to occur or what sort of change you might see, but you know you want to track it. And you want to put some kind of indicator there, but you don't know enough about what the change might look like. You want to keep it broad. And another instance where that might be relevant is where you've got lots of different projects under a program, and how do you set an indicator that's relevant to all those projects, but also honours the diversity of those projects? Because if you start to set specific indicators at that level to apply to a range of projects, they start to lose their meaning for the individual projects. So that's another example where we use an open vessel indicator. So we might say, imagine a bunch of 10 different projects under a program that's trying to influence policy change somewhere. Maybe your indicator is instances of policy change rather than saying we expect to see this kind of policy change. It looks exactly like this, and then tracking that. If you that makes it quite narrow. So keeping it more open means you can still track the number and type of policy changes that have come about as a result of your program, but you're not being super specific on what they actually need to look like. And a rubric is what a rubric does is help make a judgment about how good something is. So a rubric helps you define performance at different levels. So in a sense, it talks about the hurdle target and the stretch target in the same thing, except it usually has more levels than two. So it usually has a poor performance and a okay performance and a good performance and a very good performance, something like that. And it defines what success looks like at each of those levels. So what would it look like if we were really excellent? What would it look like if we were okay? What would it look like if we were doing this poorly? And helps you grade your project against that. And it might be that you expect to be at some sort of standard or level at some point in time. But over time, you might change, evolve what your rubric looks like to make sure that any developments in your project are accommodated by this new definition of success. I think after a while of practicing developing measures, you get a good sense of what's useful, but it is always very, very context specific for your project. Thanks, Fatina.
You happy to me to proceed for the next question, or?
Sure.
Okay. And just for those who arrived late, it's more of a question and answer session. So anyone who's got any questions related to developing a theory of change or developing a measurement framework that you've had over the last few weeks, we're just using this opportunity to ask any questions here. So one of the other questions is along the same lines in terms of measurement. So to what extent should we balance the qualitative and quantitative measures?
Yeah. It feels like every answer starts with, it depends. But it is true. There are examples where it makes no sense to use qualitative data because the type of project you're running and the kinds of results you're looking for lend themselves so well to quantitative measures that is absolutely the right choice. I guess what quantitative measures tend to do is they will tell you a lot about what's happened, but it won't help you understand much about why. So qualitative measures are a nice complement. In other circumstances, your project, the way it's designed, it may not lend itself very well to quantitative measures. And you need to think about qualitative measures that are actually appropriate. So that, again, there's no right or wrong. It does depend on your project and the nature of your project and what's useful for your project. But I guess the overarching principle from our perspective is to try and keep in mind that both are useful and you should use both where appropriate. We have this expression, a clear horizon, and I'm sure I've said this before in the training, no numbers without stories, no stories without numbers. And we find that if you have some numbers with some stories, you get a much better sense of the project. And that if you just have stories alone, some people will be disappointed because they'll want to see some numbers, and numbers are often helpful as well. So, you know, it's good to be always keep an open mind about what's useful.
Thanks, Leanne. I was just waiting to see if anyone had any follow-up questions to that. Feel free to unmute yourself as well if you do have any follow-up questions there. Okay. So another question on measurement as well, whose perceptions or values should we use for measurement?
This is a really great question. This is where rubrics do come in really useful, because they do surface what is valued about projects and their outcomes. So, so the question again, Keisha, was whose values and perceptions should we, yeah. So in a project where you're working with community, for example, on trying to achieve some kind of change, obviously the community perception of when the project is being successful is really, really important, because most community projects are trying to enable some kind of change that the community can own and wants and can sustain by themselves. So understanding that what's valued about that project by the community is super, super important. If you're running a project where you've got multiple government stakeholders and different government agencies are expecting to see some kind of results, obviously their values or perceptions of what good looks like for your project are really important. So it does depend on context. I think a lot of projects are evaluated with the project manager and the funder's needs in mind and their definitions of success, and not much attention is paid often to what the beneficiary's definition of success might be. So I think the answer to the question around whose values and perceptions should be included, I would say there's a big difference between should and what's actually practically achievable. So the beneficiary's values should be there somewhere, whether that's by asking them directly or by assuming that the project manager knows enough about what's important to the community and can bring their thinking to those discussions. But oftentimes, I think the definitions of success of a project and what gets measured and what good looks like is often defined, unfortunately, not by the beneficiaries of the project, but by what the funder wants to see and believes is the right thing to value. There's a lot of literature about looking at values in evaluation, and if you're interested in that, we can provide you, we can direct you to those resources. But it's a really interesting concept, and there's a lot of discussion about it in the evaluation world.
So Ali's got a question in the chat. So how can we attribute program impact without counterfactual or control group, especially where competing programs exist over longer time?
Yeah, This is really a issue that's often raised. I think that when we remember it's actually very, very hard to attribute impact. That's just the truth of any program. It's very, very hard to attribute impact. Remember when we talked about in the theory of change, the spheres of control, sphere of influence, and sphere of interest. And your sphere of control, where there is absolutely no question about attribution, lies at that activity level. We train people and then now they're trained. So this activity output, sort of immediate outcome level. The attribution, there's no question of that. Once you start to get beyond that into the outcome sphere, sphere of influence, you start to lose the ability to prove attribution. And what most evaluation methods are about is trying to strengthen the demonstration of contribution rather than attribution. And there's very rigorous methods for that called contribution analysis. But if I go back to the original question, which is how do you attribute impact without a control group? And you're right, if you're working in an environment where a control group is feasible, then obviously you've got far greater chance of being able to demonstrate impact and attribute impact. Most times we don't have that opportunity. Obviously in agriculture, you're demonstrating, seed varieties in different crops, one being control group and one being not, or possibly even implementing some kind of capacity building program in one agency or one village and not another. You can possibly, describe impact and have, strong confidence in attribution. Mind you, there's a whole bunch of ethical reasons why running control groups is not always practical or useful. But a very simple way to try to strengthen your case for attribution is to be able to ask people themselves what caused the change for them. So if you're trying to build someone's capacity to do something differently and you see examples of change behavior, those change behaviors may not be as a result of your program necessarily, or your program may have only been part of the reason. And that's because all sorts of factors come into play when people decide to change their behavior. And it's not necessarily the training they've received or the awareness raising campaign, or it's often as much to do with time, money, what my neighbour's doing, what I heard in the paper, all sorts of things. So I think the thing to remember is that it is possible to attribute impact without a control group. It's difficult and it's often, control groups are expensive. It can be expensive trying to do attribution even without a control group because of the amount of data you need and just the time-consuming process of it all. So it is possible. It's sometimes the effort is not really worth it, and what you really are probably most oftentimes better off trying to do is have a good method for demonstrating contribution in a rigorous way rather than trying to prove attribution, because it is very difficult to do. That might not be the answer you're wanting to hear. But thanks for thanking me anyway, Ali.
All right. So next question is, I guess, could you elaborate more about most significant change, or MSC? So that was in the content for this week as a measurement tool.
Yeah. Okay. So the most significant change method can be implemented in different ways, but what it does is it's a great tool for surfacing unintended outcomes. And it's also you can design MSC to look at specific domains of change and deliberately try to harvest the outcomes related to those domains you're interested in. So getting some, short cycle data back through the most significant change technique is a good way of just keeping an eye or seeing some of the outcomes that are coming about as a result of your program. And then, of course, you can also use it as an evaluation method. But the process, and we actually have a free user guide on our website that talks about the process in quite some detail, but it's also a user guide, so it's quite user friendly. Talks about how to set it up, how to collect the stories, and then how to review the stories, and then how to choose or select the stories that are most significant. The great thing about MSC as a technique is it allows us to surface all the kinds of change that people are experiencing as a result of participating in a project, irrespective of what the program is trying to achieve. And it will give you some data that is about what you were trying to achieve, but it'll also give you a lot of rich data about other things that are useful for you to understand about the broader impact of your program, but are not necessarily the things you were trying to achieve. But they might be positive unintended outcomes. Sometimes you get negative unintended outcomes as well, but the MSC technique tends to surface positive unintended outcomes. Some of those will be very directly related to what you want to measure, and others will be interesting examples of change that are useful for you to know as a project manager.
Great, thank you, Leanne. Another question from the chat box from Maribel. How do we determine that our measures are enough to achieve our broader goal, or how to formulate good measures to achieve our goal?
Yeah, how to do that. Yeah, it's a really good question. It's hard to know. I would say we have to remember that the measures are indications that we're achieving change, but they don't create the change in and of themselves. You don't need to achieve your broader goals. The whole purpose of a broader goal is to articulate what your program is trying to contribute towards, why you have your program in the first place. So the first thing I'd say is that you need to make sure that you're achieving your end of program outcomes, and have confidence that those end of program outcomes are directly related to or are going to contribute to the broader goals. You certainly don't need to prove that your contribution to a broader goal. So that's, I guess, the first thing I'd say. Then how to select, I think, just getting really clear on your program logic or your theory of change, that should give you a very good sense first on whether your program is designed in a way that is likely to be effective in getting to your end of program outcomes. And then the measures you choose are the kinds of things that you want to know about your program, but they don't, they help you stay on track and help you get towards your end of program outcomes, but they don't ensure that it happens, because there's a whole bunch of things that happen on programs that see outcomes realized or not. But your measures are there to give you some confidence that you are on track, but they can't magically make sure that you achieve your end of project outcomes. I think mostly what we're trying to do, think about the role of program logic, which is describe how change is expected to occur, and the role of measures to describe how much change is enough. You need to understand the extent of the problem that you're trying to address with your program, and then what would good look like. So if we use the example that I'm familiar with, where we have the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, and there's rivers that run into the Great Barrier Reef area, and the farming in those areas around the rivers is creating sedimentation problems, pesticide problems, and eutrophication, so poor water quality running down the rivers and into the Great Barrier Reef area. And there's been lots and lots and lots of money spent on water quality improvement programs. And they are focused on changing landholder behaviour in relation to how much fertiliser they use on their crops in that catchment. so that when the rain comes and washes stuff from their crops into the river, it doesn't take too much stuff into the low water quality into the reef catchment. So to be effective, you need to understand, one, how bad is the water quality already? Two, how much less fertilizer use in tonnes do we need to see in this catchment to improve the water quality to a satisfactory level? Then you've got to work out how to get those tonnes out of the system. Like, how many landholders need to be involved, or is it 2 landholders with really large properties, or is it lots of little landholders and it's all of them doing a small amount of practice change? So understanding what the real source of the problem is, and then understanding the amount of, in this example, how many tonnes of fertilizer do we need to remove from the system to make the water quality better? And so that's an example where you actually need to understand the numbers really well to set appropriate targets. And then you can say, okay, we have a target of this many tonnes removed, and that means this many landholders in these areas removing this many tonnes each. And that's how you would set those sort of measures. So there's a bit of maths there, I suppose, for that particular problem. That's the kind of thinking you need to bring to deciding, what sort of targets are you going to attach to your measures to ensure that you are going to achieve your end of program outcomes. What level of adoption do you need? That sort of thing. Does that make sense? It's not easy to set those measures. Not for a new program anyway.
Do you think, just I'm curious as well, just to follow up on that, in terms of setting those measures up from the beginning, is it something that you could write a story about as you're setting it up to kind of identify definitely what it is that you want to know about your program as well?
Yeah. So you
like a hypothetical story?
Yeah, like writing a narrative of like what the program would look like if it was successful, or what the change would actually look like if it was successful.
Yeah, that's right. So like from your Great Barrier Reef example, just saying, as a result of this program, at the end of 10 years or so, X amount of tonnes were, of wastewater were not, didn't trickle into the Great Barrier Reef, and as a result, there was, X, Y, and Z species able to come back and things like that. Is that something?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess I had never thought about writing the story to identify the measures, but that's probably, I mean, you certainly write a story using the measures when you're trying to tell the story of what you did achieve. I hadn't thought about it from the perspective of writing it before the change had happened to then help identify your measures. But yeah, I'm sure that would really be helpful in some circumstances.
So I guess on a different track now, Annie's asked a question about theory of change. So how do we know if we've written an effective narrative for our theory of change? Which components should be highlighted more than others?
Ah, yeah. How do we know if we've written an effective theory of change? I guess if you share it with people who you want to know about your program and understand it, then, and do they understand it? Does it make sense to them? That's, I guess, the first indication of a good narrative. I think the main purpose of narratives is to help describe the model in words, which is important for a lot of people to actually have a text-based description of the model. A lot of program designs describe the activities and the high-level objectives or outcomes, but they don't talk about how those activities lead to those outcomes, which is the whole purpose of theory change. So I guess making sure you're really clear about the intermediate outcomes is good. And of course, they're in the model, so writing to that. I think the thing I like the most about a narrative is that it brings in some of the principles for a program. So your model doesn't necessarily show the principles so well, doesn't articulate the principles so well. So being able to bring some of that in. And then the other great thing about a narrative is you can actually talk about some of the assumptions at the same time. If we're describing this pathway of change and this one, we can talk about the key assumptions or the key assumption underpinning those pathways of change in the narrative. And so, we each have a model, we have some principles by the side, and we have some assumptions as well, and they're all sort of separate. And so the narrative allows you to bring those things together. So I'd say that's a very important thing to highlight. And then otherwise, I think, if you've got pathways of change or outcomes pathways that, that everyone's pretty familiar with, you understand that's how change occurs. They might not need too much explanation, but I think it's really worthwhile explaining those parts of your program that are newer or relatively untested, and maybe some pilot elements of your program, stuff that you haven't done before. You're not really sure how change is going to occur, and so writing about that in probably a bit more detail than the pathways of change that you're very familiar with would be a useful thing as well. We do have a sort of checklist for writing a narrative, and I think it is part of the training materials, Keisha, yeah, where I think a good narrative starts with a clarification of what the problem actually is that you're trying to address through your program. So being really clear about the problem statement is a really important contextual element of your theory of change narrative. Sorry, I'm drinking a lot. I've been running a 8-hour workshop. I finished it 10 minutes ago, so I've been talking all day, so I'm a little bit thirsty. Yeah, we can resend the list to check the narrative for sure. Yeah.
So from Caroline, so just in case the project did not achieve the outcome, so X% of increase of households' income, would that mean that the project has failed?
Right. Okay. So I think X% increase of household income, that's a measure and a target against an outcome of maybe improved livelihoods or something like that. Does that mean the project has failed? This really depends on whether you know enough about the project context in order to, there's many reasons why projects don't achieve their outcomes, right? And some of them are related to the way the program was designed in the first place, and we weren't sort of clear on some key assumptions or whatever. It doesn't necessarily mean, I think my straight answer would be, it doesn't necessarily mean it has failed. There's different reasons why we set different targets and different measures. And sometimes we don't really know how change is going to occur. Like in a pilot project, we're actually trialing something. We don't really know if it's going to work. The point of the pilot is not to achieve a certain percent. The point of the pilot is to see whether this model works, whether this kind of project approach works. So as long as the project has achieved that understanding, as long as implementing the project led to that learning, then you can say the project was successful. Like experiments, people talk about failed experiments, but experiments are experiments, right? And there's no such thing as a failed experiment, because through the experiment you're trying to work out something. And so even if you didn't get the result you were looking for in an experiment, it tells you something, right? It still gives you new knowledge, and that's the whole point of the experiment. So I think if a funder said, here's some money and we expect you to improve livelihoods of 500 households as a result of this money, and you reached, you improved the livelihoods of 300 households, the funder might say it's a fail, or they might say you didn't achieve as much as we thought you would achieve, but you were still successful with 300 households. So again, it depends on what the definition of failure is. Yeah, it's not that black and white, but maybe a funder would have a different opinion.
And I guess that's why it's important to measure it along the way, so you're not just finding out that information at the very end of the project as well. So you can see if you're progressing towards the target, and then if not, flagging it early with the funder or changing the way that you're delivering the project to meet that target as well.
That's right. And sometimes we don't know enough to set a target. Sometimes we have an indicator like increased household income, but we don't actually set a target because we don't know enough about what good would look like. And it's only when the project's finished that we understand whether what an appropriate target might have been.
I hope that answers your question, Caroline.
Yes, Keisha and Leanne, thank you for that. I think what Keisha said was the case. The target was set very high, not considering the reality on the ground. And I think there was also the measurement. I think the monitoring was also an issue. Thank you for that. I just actually came from a meeting from that project, and those were some of the issues that were discussed. The topic as well of having a control group versus the beneficiaries of the project, that also came out. So really, I'm very thankful for this training because uh, very timely to the projects that we're currently involved. Thank you.
Yeah. And Carolyn, that's just reminded me of something. Like, it can be very risky setting targets. If you're going to set a target, you have to understand the context on the ground, right? There needs to be a rationale, a good justification for why the target has been set. There needs to be some evidence for why the target is appropriate. And that means you need to understand what household incomes look like now and what the reality is on the ground, like you say, and come up with a reasonable target, something that's achievable. That's a really important part of the design of any targets you attach to a project.
And following on from that, Ali's just asked a question as well. So should all relevant stakeholders agree on the set targets? And if there are any revisions needed, then do the key stakeholders need to agree on that as well?
Yeah, ideally, yes. And then, of course, the question comes up, who's considered a stakeholder, who gets to have a say, and who gets to make the final decision. But I think, in fairness, there should be, like I said before, a very clear rationale for why a target has been set at the level it has. And people should be able to see it. There should be some transparency around how that target was set, so that people can question the methodology for setting the target or the process for setting the target, rather than focusing on the target itself, but to understand what assumptions were made, essentially. What assumptions did we make when we set this target, and are they still right? And how confident are we in those assumptions right now? Confidence may change as you implement your project, but yeah, being very clear about what reasonable targets are. This is where I think a rubric is useful, and I've seen some clients do this before, where there was a changing funding environment and they weren't sure how much money they were going to receive. So for decades, they've been receiving this fixed amount of money every year to manage, do some land management in Australia. And then the Commonwealth government changed its mind and said, actually, we're going to start to change the way the funding model looks like. And they weren't sure if they were going to get 100% of their funding in the first year, or 80%, or 60%. And so they set targets at 3 different levels. They set a target for, business as usual. If we get the same money as we always get, this is the target that we accept. This is the target we will suggest if we get 80% of the funding, and this is the target we'll suggest if we get 60% of the funding. So that's one way. That's thinking about what's relevant in terms of the funding that's available. But as we know, it's not necessarily more money equals more households, right? It doesn't necessarily work like that. So in this way, you can also set a rubric that might distinguish between average performance, good performance, and excellent performance. And maybe the funder says, okay, we'd really like to see average performance across everybody, but if some are not acceptable and some are excellent, then that's okay too. So yeah, but yeah, definitely a conversation.
Just another question as well. How often do we review our measures or a theory of change as well?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say not too often, but often enough. So imagine you're running a project, you ran it last year, you ran it the year before, maybe you've ran this type of project many times. You know what sort of measures are useful. You use them. You probably don't need to review them very often at all. But when we are implementing something for the first time, we definitely need to be checking in far more often. When you're collecting measurement data, you very quickly get a sense of whether it's useful or not. If you are getting some data that you are actually not using to make any decisions, you're not using to take any action, you might question the value of that measure, and you might drop that measure and choose something else that would be more useful, something that would actually help you make decisions or help you take action for your project. So I think you, through the use of measures, you soon get a sense of whether they're useful or not. And so as soon as you understand that something's not really working for you, you should revise it or drop it. Or you'll get a sense that you're not getting enough information and maybe you need to add an extra measure in. So that's obviously when you would revise your set of measures to make sure you're getting, as a set, what you need. Same with the theory of change. I believe you should revise it when you get a new understanding of your project, right? So when you have a sense that you understand better now how it's working, then you should revise your model. But otherwise, I wouldn't, maybe it's good to annual reflection. I don't know if it depends on the length of the project. Maybe it's a 4-year project. Maybe once a year, you just have a look at it, check in, make sure with others that this is broadly still how you think the change is going to occur. And you may be monitoring some of your assumptions. Maybe your assumptions, you're less confident in some of them, or you're more confident in some of them. And so, that gives you a sense of whether your theory of change is kind of right or not. So again, I would revise that as soon as you have new information that's available, and maybe at a minimum, at least every year.
Great. We probably have time for a couple more questions as well. We've got about 10 minutes to go. I'm just going to ask another one as well. So I guess the question came from last week, just do we use software to collect data? So if anyone can remember asking that question, if they wanted to clarify a little bit further. Otherwise, if not, we'll try and answer it in terms of what we assume you meant.
Yes, I'm not sure whether the question means, do we, as in Clear Horizon, do we use software to collect data for evaluations, or whether should we use software to collect data? I'm not 100% sure what the question is there. If anyone would like to clarify, that would be great.
Yeah, hello. I
Hi,
was the one.
Alison.
Yeah, I was the one trying to ask that question. I was trying to ask, are we going to learn how to use software in collecting data?
In this course?
Yes.
Oh, no, I don't think that's part of the course, is it, Keisha?
Oh.
I don't think so, no. So we provide some resources for tools on collecting data. And we've got a big workbook coming in the next module about different methods and how to use those methods, and resources, like linked resources for different kinds of methods. But in terms of how to practically use resources to collect data, we don't have that information in this course. It would, otherwise it'd be a full year course, I think.
Yeah. So many options. That's right. Yeah. Have you had some experience with that, Ellison, already?
So I believe you're on mute, Ellison. Sorry.
Not much. Not much. I haven't. I only tried using hard paper and collecting data, but it's not on MDL. It's on a survey. But I seem to catch that there are, I think, softwares that's available to use. Otherwise, what we are learning is very, very important than the software.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know mobile data collection is becoming very, very common, especially people who are out in the field a lot. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
yeah. In some areas, it's not practical, especially when the network not
yes.
working well. So
Yeah.
the paper and pen thing is still very
That's
good.
right.
Yeah, yeah.
To be honest, Ellison, we're a company of about 45 people. We hardly use any software for data collection ourselves, and we do many evaluations. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So myself, I still prefer the paper and pen thing method because I have time to look at the data well than the software, and also
Yeah.
it's still, yeah, I still have to improve the data when I use paper and pen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We use a lot of online surveys, so we distribute surveys online, and people fill in the Microsoft form, and the data comes back through that, which is just a way of reaching many people in a cost-effective way. But yeah, we do a lot of handheld recorder, record the interview, type it down quickly in the computer. We use some transcription software. That's for interview transcription, but that's really, we don't use much more than that, to be honest.
For me, honestly, the paper and pen, I like it. I like the
Yeah.
paper and pen because not everybody, they use phones, and they work well with paper and pen. Even
Yeah.
myself too, I don't work well with phones as well. So
Yeah.
I like to work with paper and pen. The beauty about MEL that I'm learning now is I think I'm learning a lot, especially with the beauty about what we are learning now is we are doing some evaluation work, even as the program starts or as the project starts. This is why all of these questions I'm just learning from my friends that they're asking these questions. Thank you.
Nice.
Okay. One question from Ali, which I think might be our lucky last question, Leanne.
Okay.
So just in measurement, I think an external or independent evaluator also measure to verify if a project is on track, or there could be a contradiction in the measures that need an explanation.
There can be.
Yeah, so I'm not sure whether this is a statement here, Ali, or what your question is here.
I think I just look at that question there. I think yeah, question, no problem. So yes, you're right. It's not uncommon because measurement is often done internally, right? It's often done by the people who are managing the projects. That's the whole point of measurement, is that the people who are managing the project get the measurement data and they use it to manage their project. And then sometimes that data is provided to an independent evaluator who uses it to do an evaluation. And sometimes part of the job of the evaluator is to verify those measures. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And then I think the second part of your question is there might be a contradiction in the measures. I think what you're saying is if there's a verification process, they might come up with different figures than you may have come up with, or I think that's what you mean. Yeah, and I don't really know how common that is or not. I know that we encourage people to do their own measurement, and then we use that measurement data to help, and then we collect new data as well. But it's not usually, we don't collect the same data. Usually we would collect data that would complement the measurement data. So data at the point of evaluation, more of the qualitative stuff, interviews and so forth, to complement the measurement data rather than to check the measurement data. And so, to be honest, I'd say as a company, we don't have a lot of experience in verifying other people's measurement data. We usually just take that data and use it as part of the evaluation. We don't necessarily check it, if you like. So I can't say much about our experience with verification. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think that might be all we have time for today. Thank you everyone for participating in this session, and I hope that you have enjoyed the M in MEL. So I believe Sarah will be sending you an email at the end of the week to wrap up this module and provide you with the recording, as well as any links that we've mentioned today as well. So the next module goes live in 3 weeks, so Friday, the 9th of April. So your measurement assignments, so following on from the theory of change assignments, where we'll provide all of the feedback on the theory of change assignments by the end of the week. So you may have seen some of those assignments you might have received feedback already, but the rest of them will be coming by the end of the week. So the measurement assignments, which is that second part, is due on the 2nd of April. So please get in touch if you have any difficulty submitting, so similar to last time. So the next module, the E in MEL, looks at scoping and framing your MEL work overall, going broader than just measurement, developing your key evaluation questions and choosing the methods for evaluation, as well as how to analyze it, that information. So it's quite a chunky module, but also very exciting. And I think it's probably my favorite module out of all of them. And just really quickly, just note for the next virtual sessions, daylight savings will have ended in Melbourne, in Australia, where we're based. So the next sessions will be 4 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, which I think is an hour earlier than the session that started today. So if you have daylight savings in your areas, you might just need to check the time as well. So it will still be 4 p.m. Melbourne time. So just make sure that if you need to change the clocks an hour forward or back based on wherever you are, yeah, you might need to do that. So looking forward to seeing you all in 3 weeks, and looking forward to seeing your measurement assignments as well. And we will see you soon.